Committee Room 30, signed. 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 Committee Room 30, Committee Room 30, signed. 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 Committee Room 30, Committee Room 30, signed. 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 Committee Room 30, Sound. Committee Room 30, Sound. Committee Room 30, Sound. Committee Room 30, Sound. Committee Room 30, Sound.
Into the room. Okay, I declare the meeting open to the public and I welcome members to the 15th meeting of the Public Accounts Committee. Can I advise members that the committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online. However, there could be a slight delay in moving between any private and public sessions, so please be patient. Can I also advise our incoming guests, particularly those in the public gallery, that they're welcome to use mobile devices as long as they're in airplane mode and that those devices are muted. They can connect to the Assembly Wi-Fi. The password are available in the gallery rules. It is not permitted at any time to take photographs or record the proceedings of the meeting. Okay. Can I advise members that apologies have been received from Cahill Boylan MLA? Any others, Clerk?
Not that I'm aware of.
No. Okay. Can I refer members to the pack for a copy of the draft minutes of the meeting of the 13th of June at page 8? And I seek agreement, members.
Agreed.
Thank you. No matters arising and Chair's business. Can I ask members, do they have any relevant declaration of interest to declare for this meeting? No. Okay. All right, members. We'll now proceed to the next agenda item, which is the inquiry on child poverty in Northern Ireland, the evidence session. Can I take this opportunity on behalf of the Public Accounts Committee to welcome you, Chris, the Northern Ireland Children's Commissioner. You're very welcome. Trasa Canavan, Chair of the Anti-Poverty Co-Design Group. You're very welcome. Thanks for joining us this morning. And Goretti Horgan, member of the Anti-Poverty Expert Panel. You're very welcome. And also joining us in the committee is Dorina Carville, Controller and Auditor General, and Stuart Stevenson, the Treasury Officer of Accounts for the Department of Finance. Can I refer members to the relevant papers relating to this agenda item at pages 29 to 84 of your pack. Mr. Quinn, Ms. Canavan and Ms. Horgan, welcome to the Public Accounts Committee and thank you for taking the time to meet us. If you want to make any brief opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to feed into this inquiry. So as Children's Commissioner, addressing child poverty is a priority for my office and I. And I want to open by stating that I'm deeply concerned with regards to the delay in implementing an anti-poverty strategy and the devastating effect it is having on our most vulnerable. I welcome the Northern Ireland Audit Office's report and I endorse its recommendations. I would like to state that it's startling that there's been little sustained improvement in child poverty levels since 2016, and as part of this inquiry I feel that it's important to reflect on lessons learnt with regards to the impact that high-level strategies make on the lives of children and young people. I would suggest that the current models of strategy development, delivery and reporting are not fit for purpose in terms of delivering real outcomes on the ground. Government needs to listen to children and young people, as well as organisations working with and on behalf of people in poverty throughout the strategy development process. And whilst I have quite a number of areas that I'd like to talk about, I'll open by highlighting 5 key areas for consideration. So the first is to point out that poverty is a blight on children's lives and a breach of their rights and a waste of public money. It's unacceptable that somewhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 children are living in poverty in Northern Ireland. It's also unacceptable that children are more likely to be in poverty than people of a working age or than older people. And moreover, this is not an accident. Poverty is a political choice. Government policy determines where resources are targeted to reduce poverty, and to date the resources have not been directed to children. On a positive note, we have seen the reduction in pensioner poverty a number of years ago, and that demonstrates when there is the political will, we can make change, and when this is reflected in resource allocation. We need to turn the tide and focus on early intervention, prevention and support for our most vulnerable. These arguments are well evidenced and well rehearsed, yet we are still in a cycle of short-term decision making and pouring resources into systems that are broken. The fact of the matter is that when we better invest in the public, that with better investment of public resources, we can lift children out of poverty, rather than the current system where we pay more to address the harms created by poverty. The second point is that the child poverty strategy was a legislative requirement, and yet deadlines were breached, and this is not unusual. The Northern Ireland Audit Report highlights the statutory obligation in Section 28E of the Northern Ireland Act 1998 to adopt an anti-poverty strategy. Despite the judicial review in 2015, the strategy is yet to be published. I want to know why this has been held up and why the anti-poverty strategy does not appear to be an immediate priority of the Northern Ireland Executive. As far as I can see, there is no reason why this should be delayed. When requirements to develop and implement strategies are set in legislation, this reflects an absolute commitment to their delivery. However, in practice, when there is inaction or delay in response to statutory requirements, there appear to be very few repercussions. The third point is that there is insufficient focus on involving experts by experience in the development of strategies. So this can be said in relation to the child poverty strategy, the anti-poverty strategy, and indeed the children and young people strategy, where there has been very little involvement of their intended beneficiaries. In each, this was explained as unfortunate, but due to limited time and resources. This is not acceptable, particularly given the delays that have occurred in the publication of each. While the co-design groups attempted to hold focus groups with some people experiencing poverty to inform the anti-poverty strategy, this was not resourced, and there was pressure to do so within a very short time period. A more meaningful form of engagement would go beyond single focus groups and instead involve children and their parents in an ongoing, supported and resourced process. Point number 4 is that an anti-poverty strategy will require a ring-fenced budget. While we're currently operating in a very difficult financial context, and it is helpful to consider what can be taken forward without additional costs, it is essential that there is an ability to direct the allocation of resources to actions that will deliver on the strategic outcomes. The Children's Services Cooperation Act 2015 provides an enabling power for statutory bodies and agencies to pool resources and facilitate collaborative working. However, we understand that this continues to prove problematic, and examples of pooled budgets appear to be few and far between. The Minister for Finance has recently indicated her commitment in supporting collaborative working through pooled budgets. And so DOF should review the administrative barriers to pooling budgets and adapt the financial governance processes accordingly. I believe it is entirely feasible for the Executive to allocate funding to the anti-poverty strategy and to the children and young people strategy in order to encourage collaboration. The fifth point is about leadership. Leadership at the highest level is required to drive development and delivery of executive strategies. Cross-executive strategies are recognised as being some of the most important strategies, requiring close collaboration between departments and agencies to develop and deliver. However, it can reportedly be hard to even get these matters onto executive agendas and to establish a shared commitment across government. There are questions about whether ministers have the required leadership or authority across the executive in relation to ensuring other ministers to collaborate. Arguably, moving forward both the anti-poverty strategies and the children and young people strategies, moving both the children, young people strategies and the anti-poverty strategies from OFM, DFM to other departments has not been effective, and returning them to TEO should be considered. I'll pause now and invite my colleagues to come in.
Thank you, Chris.
Hello, hi, and thanks for inviting me to give evidence here. I would endorse everything that Chris has just said and just make 2 or 3 very brief comments in addition. So you'll note that the expert panel on the anti-poverty strategy did not propose a separate child poverty strategy, and there was a reason for this, and actually the reason is really outlined, I think, in the Audit Office report on the previous child poverty strategy, because we felt that if we did go for a separate child poverty strategy, it would be likely to be just another version of what we've had to date. And so that's why we proposed an Anti-Poverty Act, which includes a duty to reduce child poverty, setting smart targets and timetables, etc. And it was good to see the Audit Office, recommending a similar approach. We also were very clear that any anti-poverty strategy needs to be evidence-based. In other words, that any actions that are to be included need to have been shown to make a difference to poverty levels. Not just that they're a nice idea, but that there's actually evidence that supports them. So all of our recommendations were based on evidence, and that's why we focused on what would reduce costs to households and increase income to households. And the reason we did that is because all of the evidence shows that if you want to reduce poverty, that's what we need to do, reduce the cost of public services in particular, and since that's something that government can do, and increase income. And then finally, I just wanted to say why we suggested an anti-poverty commission as a way of monitoring and overseeing any anti-poverty strategy. And that, Chris actually made a reference to this. The idea would be that an anti-poverty commission would be independent. It would be made up of experts by experience, including children, but also, experts who know about statistics and have done the research and know what the evidence says. And again, it was good to see the Audit Office recommending a similar approach. So I'll hand you over to Tressa now for her comments.
I'll be pretty brief, just to say thank you for not just the invite to come and talk to you today, but for also undertaking this inquiry into such an important issue. As Chris has said, it's shameful that between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 children live in poverty in Northern Ireland in the day and age that we are here today. And we really can't overlook that fact. It is absolutely a disgrace. So we really need to rethink what we're doing. What we have been doing hasn't been working. That number of children in poverty has stayed largely the same for 2 decades. As the Audit Office said in their report, it stayed the same throughout the child poverty strategy. It really made no impact. While it was a very well-intentioned strategies, good intentions don't actually change the number of children living in poverty, and actually it was completely ineffective in what it needed to do. So I'm really glad that this committee is looking at it, and I suppose the important part for this committee is how we are spending our public monies. I think that we're having a lot of conversations at the moment about a lack of money, about budgets being very tight. That is true, but we must never lose sight of the fact that we are still spending millions, billions of pounds. So how are we spending that money, and how can we be more effective in how we spend that money? As Goretti said, it needs to be evidence-based, and as Chris pointed out, we have the Children's Services Cooperation Act to really enable departments to work together. There's a huge opportunity there for creativity. There's a huge opportunity there to cut through bureaucracy, which is what everybody talks about. Let's not spend money on bureaucracy, let's spend money on delivering for children and families. And that's what we really need to do. At the end of the day, we know that by investing early, the report this morning talked about the benefits of early intervention, about how you make that money back on the other side. We are already paying the price for poverty. We are just paying for it on the other end when we are faced with the consequences of it. Why not pay and actually alleviate those problems? Why not stop that becoming an issue to begin with? Are we willing to pay the price for poverty in perpetuity? Is that what we're saying? We're always just going to pay for this on the other side? We're not just going to deal with the problem? The anti-poverty strategy represents potential for change. There's a fantastic amount of work that's going on. The expert advisory panel produced a really great report, which was built upon by the co-design group. But where are we now? Where is that strategy? I have not seen it. And it makes me very, very worried that it's locked behind closed doors. Because for that strategy to even start making a difference, we need to see it, and we need to see what those actions are and how we can deliver against them. And just before I finish up, I think we really need to remember that this is about children and families in our communities, in our societies, in your constituencies, who we walk past in the street every single day. These are the people that are impacted by the conversations that we're having here in this room today. It's their lives that we want to make a difference to. And we can make a difference. That's the beauty of this. There is something that we can do. Poverty is a solvable problem. So what is the legacy of this assembly going to be? Is it going to be that we stood by and looked at the number of children in poverty stay the same for the next 20 years? Or are we actually going to do something about it? So yes, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to each of you for a very honest, hard-hitting and impactful reflection on reality as to how things are on the ground for many of our children and young people. We appreciate it. You absolutely hit the nail on the head, and we share your frustrations. You have shared a common theme that this committee continues to hear over and over and over again in relation to the silo mentality of departments and the excuses that are often found instead of reasons to actually work together in the interests of people. So thank you for that. Early intervention is also a key theme that we're continuing to hear about. And I've heard for the third time today, let alone in the function of this committee since the return of the Assembly, about the Children's Services and Cooperation Act. And we're very conscious of the fact that it has not been properly implemented across departments, and it is entirely unacceptable. So you have an open door with this committee, and we are looking forward to proceeding with this all-important inquiry. We chose this because it is a very important area for so many of our people in Northern Ireland, and by design and the vision of the Good Friday Agreement was to lift people out of all of these problems, and unfortunately they're trapped, and this inquiry hopefully will shine a bright light onto why there is no implementation of the new strategy, or why it's been so badly delayed. Delay is the theme of this Assembly, but not of this committee. We're here to shine a spotlight on these things, and hopefully this inquiry will help do that. So thank you to the three of you for that. We're going to proceed with a number of questions. Each member has a few that are relevant to specific areas, and then there'll be maybe a bit of crossover. So I'll begin, if that's okay, and this is addressed to potentially all three of you, really. It is concerning to see the high levels of child poverty being reported, and they're very well publicised now. But I'm also concerned that the statistics don't tell the full story, as they often don't. With the ongoing cost of living crisis, is the true scale of child poverty actually more widespread and deeper than reported?
You can start.
Yes, the answer is yes. So most of the statistics that you'll have seen are before housing costs. And anybody who lives in Northern Ireland knows that housing costs have gone through the roof in the last 3 or 4 years. So really, we're getting a very false picture. We know from housing executive statistics that there are now, Chris and I were talking about this just before we came in, over 5,000 children living in temporary accommodation in Northern Ireland at the minute. In other words, they're homeless. When the numbers in the Republic reached 4,000 children in temporary accommodation, it was front page news on the newspapers. It dominated questions in the Dáil. It was the scandal of the week, in fact, of a couple of weeks. Proportionately, we probably have, like, if we had the same size population as the Republic, we'd be talking about 12, maybe even 14,000 children living in temporary accommodation. And the Housing Executive tells us that the main reason that people end up homeless are financial difficulties, and in particular running up arrears. You can see why people in private rented, so more than half of the children who are living in poverty are living in private rented accommodation, and that accommodation has become so expensive now that their families are having to find as much as £110 or £120 a month in addition, you know, on top of their housing benefit. And remember, these are working families, universal credit families, as well as families who are living on benefits. And so that's just the children who become homeless, which is like the hardest bit of poverty, because that's effectively they're then destitute. But really, there's also a whole lot of families who are having to use that £110 a month that should be spent on food, that should be spent on clothing, that should be spent on heat, is instead going to rent. And that means that the after housing cost poverty figures would be far higher were we to have them, but we don't have them.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. And I think the other issue that we're not seeing is the families that are cutting back everything and the lives that they're now having to lead in order to just about scrape by. And we're looking at what bar are we setting for children in their childhoods at the moment. Whenever we talk to some of our families about what they were doing in terms of the cost of living crisis, and I think I might have talked about this at the Communities Committee, there was a dad who talked about trying to do everything he could to hold on to swimming lessons for his kids, because that was the one thing that they did that they really enjoyed and he was doing for his kids. But he had cut back everything else, and unfortunately food trumped swimming lessons, so the swimming lessons had to go. That's a family that's struggling, that's a family in poverty, and that's a family that needs support. And yet we're saying you don't deserve swimming lessons anymore. In fact, all you deserve is to be able to eat and to have a roof over your head. I mean, we're not looking for our children to thrive anymore. It's just about surviving. And that is, again, I know I've said it earlier, but it's a disgrace. It's absolutely disgraceful. This is what we're hoping for our children, that they just make it through to the next week, to the next month. So whenever we look at these statistics, it's really important to remember that what's sitting behind that is real families, real children who are just struggling day by day. And the other thing I would add to that as well is that parents do as much as they can to protect children from knowing what's happening and to protect children from understanding the depths of poverty and the impact, but children do understand, because children are very smart. They can pick up on what's going on in a family home, and they can feel that stress and that worry and that concern. I've talked to children who can tell you what a payday loan is, because they know that on payday their parents do X, Y and Z. They know about food banks. They actually know maybe it's a bit shameful to be going to a food bank, and that's stress that we're putting on young children's shoulders because we aren't getting on top of child poverty here in Northern Ireland.
Is it the case, and you make some interesting points in relation to that particular question, but is it the case, given that our society is much more resilient than the rest of the island, if you like, given what we've been through, is it the case that these challenges have become the norm, so much so that we're not hearing people speak out in a way that they are in the rest of this island in relation to this particular issue? Is that the case, do you think?
I am alarmed at how normal food banks have become and food parcels. And I suppose just to answer the first question, I would agree. I think that the real figures are probably higher. And just to pick up on what Trassa said there, when I'm speaking with children, they're telling me they're worrying about their mummy and daddy's bills. They're worrying about turning on the heat. They're worrying about the price of shopping. A child should not need to worry about those things. The Trussell Trust, between April 23 and March 24, issued 90,377 food parcels. And one report, I think it was the Belfast Telegraph, reported that 60,831 of those parcels went to houses with children. That is staggering. And in terms of the true cost, or the true figures, there's another report here. It was by the Women's Regional Consortium, and they published a report, I think last year, June 23, and they've talked about the respondents to this report. 91% of women said that difficulty paying their bills with regards to the increased cost of living. 56% were in debt. 82% had to borrow as a result of the cost of living crisis. I don't think that the data takes into account borrowing, lending. Children in communities know sometimes where to borrow, and it's not always from the most reliable sources. Let's just put it that way. It's a very dangerous situation we're in. But to answer your question, I think, and then the real-time data, sometimes the data we receive, by the time reports are published, things have moved a little. But I do think that the figures are conservative, and certainly from what I've seen in my 9 months in office, children and young people are very conscious and very worried about poverty.
Can I pick up, on your point about resilience and the impact? I suppose it's important for us to recognise the impact of the conflict in Northern Ireland and actually the trauma that has caused both to generations that live through it, but intergenerational trauma. And I mean, the report that this committee launched this morning on mental health shows the challenges that we have around mental health, and we know how closely mental health challenges are linked with poverty. So it's actually really important to recognise that these are compounding issues, and then you're going to get into a vicious cycle where somebody who's having mental health challenges may feel unable to be able to go to work because they're not getting support with their mental health. That then creates financial burden and stress, which then further exacerbates issues. So in fact, in Northern Ireland, potentially we have an even greater problem that we have to overcome here, because we do have trauma that has to be dealt with society as a whole, but then poverty being so ingrained in our society, further exacerbating those two issues and really creating a cycle that could be dangerous.
Could I also add that when we talk about resilience, yes, we're a very resilient nation really, but stigma is also at play here. And I know this because any of us who are involved in anti-poverty work regularly get called by journalists asking us, could we find a family, who's starving, or a family who's homeless or whatever. And it's very difficult, and I understand perfectly why I wouldn't want my children seeing me on the TV, saying how difficult things were or whatever. But actually the difficulties that the lengths that parents who are in temporary accommodation go to make sure, for example, that their children get to school. Some of them have to drive 50 miles round trips just to get their children to school in the morning in order to kind of keep some kind of normality going for the children. So it is a really dreadful situation, which is why there was such outcry in the south. And I suppose I kind of think we should nearly make sure that from today that there's that kind of outcry now here, because we were not going to hear individually from those families because of the stigma. And that's not something I don't think that any of us in a place as small as Northern Ireland could blame them for.
Which really points to the overall question. It's difficult to determine the severity of this particular issue amongst our community because of the stigma element. Maybe it is much higher than what is recorded, is what I'm saying, and it's difficult to determine just how much or what percentage on that basis. In terms of the strategy, I'm frustrated by the absence of specific targets to reduce child poverty in the strategy. What are your views on a strategy with no targets and no budget attached?
You want to go first?
I'm really happy to go first. I mean, not to be too blunt, but what's the point? What are we trying to do? Where are we going? What are we spending our money on? Do we have any money to spend? Again, nice words aren't going to lift anybody out of poverty. We need real action. They need to be evidence-based. We also need clear targets that have timelines. So not just at some point in the future we might do something. When? By what date? What's progress going to look like? How are we going to get there? How are we monitoring that? I think what's really, really important as well is that not only do we put a strategy in place, and this is looking ahead to hopefully an anti-poverty strategy to come, but we mightn't get everything right at the start, as fantastic as all of our politicians are and the community volunteer sector is and inputting into that and our officials. We might get some things wrong, some things might not work as we thought. So how do we review, how do we adjust as we go, how do we take account of situations that arise that we couldn't possibly have foreseen? We've seen in recent times with COVID, Ukraine, cost of living crisis, you couldn't have anticipated those. How do we flex and make sure that what we have works? So I think that as the expert advisory panel recommended and as the co-design group also recommended, that not only do we need clear time-bound targets that are backed up by funding, but the monitoring of that needs to sit with an independent body like a commission that would make sure that we are delivering on what we said we would deliver on. And wrapping that all up in legislation means that you really are being held to account, that it's, again, not just warm words that we can step away from whenever things get a bit tough, that you're absolutely committed to it and you need to deliver on it. And why would we not want to? Why do we not want to lift children out of poverty? Why do we not want to lift our families and communities out of poverty? This is something that we should absolutely be getting behind, delivering on and committing ourselves to in a very, very concrete way.
Does the lack of targets and measurables point to a department that really isn't treating this as a priority at all, or an executive?
I mean, I can start and pass. I think that it really needs to sit across every single department. That is key. Although DFC lead on this, and I'm really keen to see what DFC have been. Yeah, we need to see the full executive really get right behind the strategy. It can't be that you point over there, that's for you. And this is where something like the Children's Services Cooperation Act really comes into its own, to say we are working together, not just beside each other, not just somewhere in the same direction, but together. How do we help each other, and how do we make sure we get there? And having targets that everyone is committed to is really important. Shared outcomes and shared funding. I mean, oftentimes that's what really drives officials is, what did you spend your money on? Well, let's rethink how we're accounting for our finances. Let's rethink about how we're using our resources to deliver.
Well, the function of this committee is to ensure value for public money, and in the absence of those measurables or targets, it's very difficult to determine that, and one could be forgiven for saying that it's a bit typical of how government has operated for a long time. The child poverty strategy ended in 2022, and the new anti-poverty strategy has been in development since 2020, and Chris, you've rightly explained your frustration in relation to those delays, as we all share. What impact are you seeing on the ground on children's lives of having no strategy in place for over the last few years?
Yeah, well, look, before coming into post, I had already identified that poverty would be probably the priority area, that we would need to work on, because the simple fact of the matter is other areas, this has an impact on so many other areas of a child's life. We talk about education, health, justice, housing. Often poverty is a driver, and sometimes poverty is a consequence of injustice. So the real life, the effect that this is having on children and young people's lives is for some devastating. We have a special educational needs crisis at the minute. Mm-hmm. We're sitting, I know this is a slightly different topic, but we're sitting right now with more children than ever, present them with more complex needs, and we have to think about how poverty relates to the crisis that we're having within special educational needs as both a cause of and a consequence of. So yeah, I've visited many communities and many young people and parents, and I would argue that in times of crisis, children and young people's rights suffer the most, and we have been through over a decade of crisis after crisis, from austerity to COVID-19 to cost of living, government instability, and children and young people's rights have suffered disproportionately.
Absolutely. It's very clear that is indeed the case. Diane?
Thanks, Chair. Pardon me. I think the three of you touched on the point that the Audit Office report made in terms of the strategy that ended in 2022. There was no marked improvement under the strategy, so the fact that there's been no strategy for the past 2 years, it's hard to say that things are any worse than under a strategy that wasn't delivering well. So I just wanted to ask, in terms of, is a strategy the answer here, or how do we make a new strategy the answer? What does it need to do that the old one didn't?
Targets?
Well, so first of all, in terms of an anti-poverty strategy, there is the executive is actually required to produce an anti-poverty strategy, both under the Northern Ireland Act 1998, under the St Andrews Agreement, under the go on, give me something that was the Stormont House Agreement. You go through them all, and they all say that the executive will produce an anti-poverty strategy. There's actually a High Court ruling that says exactly the point that the Chair was making. What is a strategy if it doesn't have targets, etc. The High Court said it's not a strategy. Yeah. It's not a strategy if it doesn't have clear targets, time-limited targets, and can be evaluated. So the point, really, the purpose of a strategy is that you can actually measure if there's any change happening. So that's the point. That's the reason why the High Court said that there needs to be one. That's not vague as anything that we've had, in the kind of vagueness that we've had in everything so far. We've seen elsewhere that such strategies can actually help to reduce child poverty. In fact, we saw it here and across the UK in the 2000s up until about 2012 or so, 2012, 2014. We actually saw child poverty going down as a result of the Child Poverty Act and the child poverty strategies, which were, did have the smart targets that we're talking about here.
The other thing is, whenever we talk to young people about an anti-poverty strategy, they can go, what's the strategy? Well, it's a plan. And now we're telling our young people we have no plan for dealing with poverty in Northern Ireland. So
what would be the better plan? That's kind of the point I'm making. We're sort of saying that it failed before, we've got nothing now, we really need just to think what will make it better.
So a better plan would be the recommendations from the expert advisory panel and also the co-design group. We put together nearly 100-page document which set out recommendations that were evidence-based, and I think that was key, and the department really pressed us on that. They said, if you're making any recommendation in this as part of this process, it absolutely needs to be informed by evidence, and we can't just kind of have nice ideas and thoughts. So it's about evidence-based actions, it's about having those clear timelines, it's about having targets. So again, what is our overall target? Well, for us in the co-design group, it was eradication of poverty. It's not just reducing it, because that says that we're okay with a number of people living in poverty. We're not. We want to get rid of poverty, but we also appreciate you can't do that overnight. So how do we get there? What is our timeline on that? What does it look like? What does progress look like? And so we can hold ourselves to something, because I don't doubt that everyone in agreement right across the board agrees that we need to get rid of poverty on every level, but until we actually put action behind that, and again timelines so that we can have something to work towards, we're really not going to get there.
Yeah, could I just add, learning from what we've done in the past, if you look at the child poverty strategy, the targets within it were aspirational rather than specific. It didn't contain any new actions, so it almost felt like recycled actions, so I absolutely agree. What we need to do differently is look at the government have adopted an outcomes-based accountability approach. So in any new strategy, we would have to have specific, measurable and time-bound targets, actions linked to that, and a resource. But also I do believe that we need to think seriously about an act, because that act would establish a legal duty to reduce child poverty. Because and the other thing would be where the strategy sits. So at the minute, I feel that an executive strategy should sit within the executive office. And that would enable those actions and outcomes to be delivered.
Thank you. Cheryl Brownlee.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for the update so far. I suppose this is the first time I've got to use Maslow's hierarchy of needs at a committee, but it's something I've always referred to, and I suppose it's very basic. If somebody can't meet those psychological needs, they're not going to go much further. They're the fundamental building block of life. And we're looking at it so often now about people struggling to get food, struggling to get shelter. I mean, that's just the very, very basic before you look at anything else, So it's great that underpins everything here. So I suppose my question really is, it's about silo working. We're often talking about that. We talked about it just at our lunch earlier on today. So just want to see, from the panel, your opinion on silo working and how it can be done better.
Yeah, look, this is something that my office and I are looking very closely at, and we're trying to breathe some life into the Children's Services Cooperation Act. I hosted a roundtable just in the last few weeks with children's champions from across each of the departments, which was a very positive meeting. But I do think there's an onus. I said in my introduction there, perhaps there's an onus on the Department for Finance to help remove the bureaucratic or the barriers that exist when budgets and resources are pooled. So I think that's one of the barriers within the Children's Services Cooperation Act. But the silo working is absolutely an issue. I would argue that we need to do work across departments, but also within departments. And that is a theme across many areas that we're grappling with in my office. So how we solve it, I think it requires leadership. I welcome the Finance Minister's comments recently about pooling resources, but again, that needs to be put into action. We need more than words. We need more than words on a page. We need this to be led by ministers and by permanent secretaries, in my opinion.
And how could you see that action is actually embedded and then measured moving forward?
So I think that really what we need to do is we need to persuade the different departments that they can actually save money if they work together with other departments. So, for example, you take what I was talking about earlier, the number of children who are homeless. I have to say that I have a personal reason for being really, really my imagination caught by this, because I remember hating going away on holidays if I had to share our hotel room with children, because you don't get a good night's sleep or anything. Well, can you imagine doing that for 2 or 3 years? And we have some families who've been doing it for 5 years. So it is a really awful situation to be in. At the moment, it is costing the housing executive £32 million a year to keep those about 4,000 families in that temporary accommodation. Can you imagine what could be done with that amount of money in terms of, for example, say after schools clubs or breakfast clubs or whatever? So the Department for Communities, which looks after the housing executive, could then use that money to do something else. I'm actually saying that and I'm just thinking, is that AME? Anyway, I'm not sure, but I'm sure somebody can figure that out. But that's just an example. That's probably a bad example if it is under AME. But the point is that very often we think we're saving money by not, for example, ensuring that we pay the full rent on private rented accommodation when there are, particularly when there are children available. I'm really only interested in what's happening with the children. But by paying that little extra amount, we can actually save millions sometimes. And I think that departments need to be persuaded of that. And I guess that's your job.
That's a very good point.
Can I just pick up on a point on that? I think that what we also really need is leadership. I think that officials, they know that it is possible. They are very aware of the theory of it. And I think that many are bought into the idea of it. But often it can feel like you're maybe breaking new ground or you're doing something that hasn't been done before, and that can feel daunting. So we really need leadership to say, not only is this what you should be doing, but this is what we expect you to be doing. So that obviously comes from yourselves in terms of holding them to account and creating that expectation, but then within and changing that culture within departments to say, we expect our civil service to function in this way and to be able to flex and respond to need, because silo working is costing us a huge amount of money. I mean, that Greta absolutely hit the nail on the head, and we're just being so ineffective, and we talk about how little money we have, so let's, with the money that we do have, be much more effective and really get to the root of the problem.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think we've often talked about silo work, and we've talked about it for a long time, but it's how then we move past that conversation into action, and it really is a collaborative approach. No one department is going to be able to solve this. It's everybody working together, moving forward. So no, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Can I also add, sorry, just on that piece, I think the community voluntary sector really have a role to play in that collaborative working, because you're right, it doesn't just sit within departments even of themselves, that we have to make sure that we as a society are working together towards that. And there are some fantastic examples of working collaboratively. One of our services in North Belfast, Thrive, does that collaborative piece fantastically. It brings in justice, communities, health, education, all putting in money together to deliver outcomes for the community. And we want to see, that's on a small scale, so how do we replicate that on a much bigger scale, and how do we make sure that we're effective? So I completely agree.
Could I just add very briefly, the Thrive project, I've worked with them before, but one of the barriers from talking to people involved has been that administrative burden. So when you're sharing money across departments or agencies, the bureaucracy can be really problematic. So I think that's why I'm looking at DOF perhaps to provide guidance on how we reduce that bureaucracy and enable the pooling of resources. And Thrive is doing it very well, but that's one of the barriers that they're grappling with.
In what way does the Children's Services and Cooperation Act enable that in terms of a requirement of government to function in that way?
Well, the Act places a duty on government departments to collaborate, and it's all framed in the well-being of children. The pooling of resource is referenced as it enables it. But but I don't believe that we're living that piece of legislation out. I don't know if it requires secondary legislation, but we need to breathe life into that. And it does seem, from talking to people at various different levels, it sometimes sounds that it's more of a problem than an opportunity. And I think we have to change that mindset. As Grady said, this is going to save money. If we use this act, it's going to save money and it's going to make children's lives better. So my question is, why on earth are we not doing it?
I think the thing about the Children's Services Cooperation Act is that it sets out what is possible, but it doesn't tell anyone how to do it. And that exactly is, that's where we need the guidelines, that's where we need the frameworks, that's where we need to say, here's the steps you can take. So I think that guidance and leadership from the Department of Finance would be really valuable here in saying to departments, if you're looking to operate under the Children's Services Cooperation Act, which you should do, this is how you would go about it.
Yeah.
Does it need strengthened in terms of legislation then to ensure action is taken in terms of those necessary
I'm not sure if it's necessarily legislation. I mean, we do have the framework there, but it's the practicality. So this is often where you get that, how do you bring legislation to life, like you're saying? So what do departments, what are the barriers for them? What do they need to be able to feel facilitated and enabled to use that legislation? I don't know that it's necessarily further legislation, but
Be done by regulation, you
Yeah.
know. There's no reason why it's more like the legislation is fairly clear.
Yeah, it is.
The question really is just about the implementation of it.
Very clear.
Some regulations maybe from you folks.
It's so clear that it's not been adhered to.
And Chair, we're still awaiting an update. That particular act, we're awaiting an update from the Department of for Education with regards to the implementation and effectiveness of that particular act, and we're yet to see any report on that. So I think that will be an interesting.
Hope you're not in good mood today. You read that, because it'll not be good reading. Okay, Colin Gildernew.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you all for the evidence to date. A lot of themes there are coming across repeatedly, and there are things that we are so well aware of now, but we're still behind the curve in terms of taking that next step. And even in my own social work experience, you know, that very frustrating understanding that if you could only get out there that wee bit sooner, you would actually head off so many difficulties, and the issues will be so much easier and, in financial terms, cheaper to address. I think it's very, in many ways, overlaps the earlier inquiry the report that we produced earlier around invest to save, and that idea of getting upstream of some of these issues is so fundamental. Also, in terms of my role in the Committee for Communities, we have expressed our frustration at the slowness of bringing the anti-poverty strategy forward. Given all the work that has already been done on that report, it's really important that we, and I think while I fully agree with the need for cross-departmental executive, someone needs to be championing that, and to me that's the community's role to champion and drive that at the executive level. So I suppose one of the things that we've heard about the recurring issue about silo working, the other recurring issue that we've heard in this committee and in other committees is around the data and lack of data that we have here often in some of these key areas. And I have often would have quoted within the health role that I did previously, the concept of what gets measured gets done, and the much more dangerous corollary of that of what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So, and you've mentioned it, Chris, in your opening remarks around the need for real-time data. So my question would be, what do you think we would need to be doing to change the data we have, or how do we capture data better or deploy and use the data better? What would your suggestion be in that area?
Yeah, I think there's so much in that, and it's a really fundamental piece of the jigsaw, and it's something that we come across a lot, you know, in different areas that we're looking at. I think there is definitely data. There's a lot of data. We're recording data on ourselves every minute of the day through these little devices we hold. Schools are recording data, health are recording data. There seems to be a nervousness about how we share that across different disciplines. Absolutely, there's probably areas that we need to delve deeper into in terms of what we're recording and how we're evidencing that. But I do think a frustration of mine is the sharing of the sharing of data, and how we can use that to identify trends. And you're also alluding to early intervention. So again, a theme across different areas is the need for early intervention and how we support children and families from the earliest stages of their lives. And at that stage, you're at that stage of life, there's health visitors involved. There's different people involved in the life journey of a child, and it's how we record those milestones and share that data across different disciplines to put the resources where they're needed. So I'm not sure I've answered your question.
Well, certainly partly. I suppose it links again back to the silo thing, and somebody said that we'd be better looking at them as castles rather than silos, and as people working in their own little castles. And I think that's something that we fundamentally need to cut through and find a better way of addressing that. But
we do have some centralised data, like the Family Resources Survey, households below average income surveys, and we're told by NISRA that actually the sample sizes of those surveys are too small to tell us very much. Obviously, the next thing you say when somebody tells you a sample size is too small is, well, why don't you increase the sample size? And they're basically saying that that's too expensive. But really, we have to grasp that nettle at some stage. So the sample size has been getting smaller as our population grows, so like proportionately. So for example, when you take something that's really important for child poverty, like persistence of poverty. So if a child is living in poverty for like 3 out of 4 years, of any 4 years, that does dreadful damage to their lives. Children can handle a year or two in poverty, that's not so bad. But in terms of the educational outcomes, the chances of them, if they're a boy ending up in prison, if they're a girl ending up pregnant as a teenager, all the kind of outcomes that we don't like to see, their chances are much, much greater if they're living in persistent poverty. We know from some research that was done nearly 20 years ago now, that there used to be a very high level of persistent poverty in Northern Ireland. That we can't really tell very well now what the level of persistent child poverty is. We have figures for persistent adult poverty, but not for children. And the reason is because the sample sizes are just so small that they can't actually follow, particular enough families year by year to know. So we really got to do something to address that, or else you're going to have in 10 years' time, you'll have the equivalent of me back here, and I'm retiring soon. But like the equivalent of me back, and then you'll be saying the same, they'll be saying to you, we can't say anything about child poverty because the data has gone so bad. We can tell some stuff obviously from what they call administrative data, the social security figures and that, but they don't really tell you the kind of thing that those surveys do. So really I would say that if you talk to anybody who's working in the poverty field, they will say, NISRA really, you need to get NISRA in here and say to them, why aren't you? What do you need to get this better data? And why aren't you asking for the for what you need to do that? Yeah. I don't know who's in charge of NISRA. Is the Department of Finance?
Okay,
Colin. Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks very much for coming along today and for the answers so far. I think there are a few issues more important than this one. You've articulated that today, and I just want to thank you again for all the work that you're doing in the fight against child poverty. It is important, as you've already said, to remember that these aren't just statistics, and behind every one of them is a child and a family who are under pressure every single day. And it is incumbent on all of us to do all that we can. So again, I want to thank you for that. The Chair touched on this, first of all, and that's around outcomes. The Audit Office report highlights that the focus of the strategy seemed to be more on outputs than outcomes. Would you agree with that assessment, and how could it have been improved regarding that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I would absolutely agree. I mean, I think that whenever we focus on outputs, what we're doing is just counting things that we're doing, as opposed to actually looking at the difference that we're making. And I mean, I've heard people describe it as a measure of busyness, and I don't care how busy people are. What I care is the impact what they're doing has. And as Chris mentioned at the start as well, this strategy and unfortunately, subsequent conversations more recently around the anti-poverty strategy, there's a lot of conversation around what we are already doing. So let's just bring in a lot of what is already being done and say that it's to tackle poverty. That's, again, there are fantastic pieces of work going on. I'm not trying to say that everything is not working. We've got Sure Start doing incredible work, but that's there. We now need to build on that. We now need to understand how we can really make a difference. So we can't just keep counting how many children went to X. What impact did going to that programme have? What difference are we trying to achieve? And again, this really brings us back to setting out what outcomes we are looking to achieve, what are the targets that we want to hit along the way there, and what is the timeline for achieving those targets. Because we can't just count heads in a room. We can't just count the number of children that received these books. What are they doing with them whenever they receive them? What are they doing whenever they get into that room or stay behind after school? Because again, that all really, really matters. And also to say, there is fantastic work going on there. So we want to see those examples of best practice and see them replicated and used to model elsewhere throughout Northern Ireland, not just have it happen really well in one little pocket of our nation. Let's let every child have that opportunity too.
Just linked to that very briefly, a point on experts by experience.
Mm-hmm.
So what does a good outcome look like for a child who's living in poverty? What does a good outcome look like for a family who are struggling to put uniforms on their children's backs and feed their children? I think that's where we need to get to. That's the level of detail. And if we talk about co-design and people with lived experiences, they need to be involved in setting those outcomes and measuring them.
Yeah. I think that point, though, both points are well made, but it touches on the previous one as around silo mentalities too, because you say there is some great work being done, but there's a lot of replication because there's no communication, and probably wastage in that respect too. So we do need a much more joined up approach, otherwise it simply isn't going to work. The second is around early intervention and prevention. So the report highlights the benefits of prevention and early intervention initiatives in ensuring fewer children experience poverty and go on to be poor adults, but says that these kind of interventions are often the first to be cut when budgets are constrained. How important is prevention and early intervention in tackling poverty, and did the strategy focus sufficiently on it?
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally important. As I said in my opening remarks, the system, we have this cycle of investing in a system that isn't really working or isn't as effective and efficient as it could be. Teresa commented earlier about the role of the community and voluntary sector in all of this, and often it's the services that they are providing that are so important to people in communities are the services that get cut or that are seen as discretionary. And for people who are using those services, they're absolutely not discretionary. So for me, early intervention is absolutely crucial, and we almost need to tip everything upside down and invest more resources at the earliest stages, as opposed to, and it's well versed, we all know this, early intervention, but it's again, we know it, it's evidenced, but we're not doing it. So,
and when it comes to disabled children, it's where you really see how counterproductive it is not to be providing that early intervention and not being doing it in the joined up way that we were talking about earlier. So, for example, we know that there are very long waiting lists for children to be assessed, for example, for autism or for other conditions. The problem is that while they're waiting to be assessed, which is the Department of Health, they can't get into a special needs school, or they can't get into a specialist nursery, which is likely to be the Department of Education. Meanwhile, the neighbourhood stuff, the community and voluntary sector, very often will take those children without the diagnosis, but without the diagnosis they won't necessarily get the payment that they should get. So sometimes they just can't take them on. And you can just see then that it's like, this is the silo working problem, but it's also that lack of early intervention that then means that a child who could have become verbal remains non-verbal for the rest of their life, with all of the additional kind of dependency issues that they would have then. And that's, and also for the child, for what they can basically you're stopping children reaching their full potential. That's what you're doing by not having that early intervention in a joined up manner. Joined up is going to be the word we're all going, the phrase we're all going to come away from, I think, from this today.
And just a very brief point of a statistic that was given to me recently was that 2 children in every classroom have undiagnosed speech and language needs, and that, you know, the cycle, you're in this cycle, and how limiting that those needs can be throughout a person's life.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think joined up is definitely the theme, as is invest to save, which has been the focus of this committee, and whether that's within the mental health strategy and our analysis of that and catching it early and dealing with it early, or in this case as well, any approach that doesn't do that is penny wise and pound foolish, quite simply, because the earlier we invest and the more that we invest at the earliest possible stages has much more impact on society and saves money down the road. It's a no-brainer, but it isn't happening, and that's what's the most frustrating thing.
We are spending this money.
Yeah,
exactly. You know, it's not that we're
just spending it the other side.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And your tagline, invest to save, could appear in our report very shortly.
Yeah, there's soon. Yeah. Thank you so much. We could go on, but I just want to get in.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks very much for your answers so far. You had, I think, all mentioned the voluntary community sector, you know, and the contribution here, and in particular you mentioned the Thrive project. So basically, in terms of the sector, is there any other examples where you've found statutory agencies working particularly well with the voluntary community sector in supporting children going through poverty?
There are pockets, you know, there are pockets of really good examples. And they're collaborating across health. But I think it's sometimes the exception as opposed to the rule, particularly where you're talking about statutory agencies. But I do think at a community level, community and voluntary sector is particularly good at collaborating. I think that the challenges are around funding, short-term funding, discretionary funding being cut, and linked to that, you'll have heard lots about the need for multi-year budgeting. So small steps like that could be enablers at a community level. I don't know if colleagues want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is some fantastic partnerships, and one of the times that we really saw that, and I know the community and voluntary sector really reflect on this as a whole, is that during COVID, the flexibility that we saw from departments, that there was a lot of let's get alongside each other to deliver support very quickly, and there was a recognition that the community and voluntary sector often had those links with families, had those links with communities, so we need to get this intervention out here. Who do we talk to? How do we get it out there? And a lot of red tape was really cut through very, very quickly. And I mean, I think that a lot of people saw that and thought, wow, this is the art of the possible. Look what we're doing here. But yet, whenever we came out the other side of it, it's like things just went back, and it was the red tape went back up again. The bureaucracy was there again, and we were no longer in a crisis. So there was no need to be working like that anymore. And I think that was quite disappointing for the sector to see what was possible, to see how quickly we could be impactful, and to see how well you could work, but then to have it reversed was very, very disappointing. So I think that, and there are definitely lots of projects that do work well. That's not to say there aren't, and I will say that statutory colleagues absolutely are trying to make a difference, absolutely, but there is a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of red tape, and there's a lot of I suppose a risk-averse nature, which is important at times, but it can't be so strong that it stops us from taking any action at all. And I think that's maybe where we've ended up.
That's a really good example coming through COVID, but like it shouldn't take us to be in a crisis.
Exactly.
To have to, you know, to push it together, to work so hard with the departments and the agencies along with the voluntary community sector, because more often than not, it's the voluntary community sector are activists on the ground that recognise a need for the community and build it up, and then it's a tag on to the government funding, whereas actually they are delivering the core outcomes. So it would be a really strong recommendation if we could, you know, try to bring through taking that learning forward. And just I'd asked about the examples of where you saw the voluntary community sector supporting children experiencing poverty. I just wondered, have you any examples of how voluntary community sector could transform the outcomes and the learning going forward?
I'd be a little bit worried about like depending too much on the community and voluntary sector for a number of reasons. First of all, because it's really been decimated over the last 10 or 15 years. And so there are large parts of the region where really there isn't a community and voluntary sector that could do what you're talking about. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there's a lot of evidence that while the community and voluntary sector are funded to do various pilot projects, and they're very often very successful and evaluated independently as being very successful, but the funding dries up because there has to be some innovation. You know, it's always like, what innovative thing are you going to do? So there is a danger that if we think that so while the community and voluntary sector wants to be part of dealing with child poverty, it can't lead on it. And it can't lead on it precisely because it's too precarious. I mean, at the moment, most community and voluntary sector organisations on the ground, you know, the local areas, their workers are under protective notice. So, you know, if your workers are under protective notice pretty much for 3 months of every year, you can't really provide the kind of consistency that children need. So I think that whatever, of course, you know, if the community and voluntary sector is resourced to do the kind of work that you're talking about, that's great, but we need to make sure that it's consistent across the region, and so that we're not ending up having, say, only Belfast or only Derry or something like that, you know, having the kind of resources that are needed. But we also need to make sure that consistency, and that consistency has been lost really because of the decimation, and that's the only word to use is decimation.
Yeah. I think it's important to, you know, just as well to, you know, to note, totally accept your point that the voluntary community sector organisations that we're talking about here, also many of them include very skilled, talented policy departments. Yes. So them working alongside the statutory bodies is really important as well. I don't just mean the direct service delivery and into the children. So just to make that point.
Yeah, could I just add very briefly, I think the best outcomes, let's think what we're trying to achieve here, best outcomes for children. I do think there is work to be done, and I believe there is work ongoing within Department for Communities about the relationship between government, or you know, government and the community voluntary sector. But the best outcomes are where trust exists. The best outcomes I've seen in voluntary and community sector models is often where funding is longer term, and that there is trust in the experts to go and deliver outcomes. And again, it comes back to bureaucracy, it comes back to sustainability. But there are great models there, but you are talking about a sector that's under immense pressure.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that your point is really well made about the policy development that goes on in the community and voluntary sector, because it's essential that expertise that is on the ground is used to inform what we're doing. We can't just have it being that there's fantastic work going on and yet it's absolutely informing nothing in terms of the policy development that's going on. So how we link all of that up is so important. And I think Goretti is absolutely right. The community and voluntary sector is being decimated, and the expertise that we are losing is it's terrifying, to be honest, because the other thing that we really need to remember is whenever we lose projects, whenever we lose teams, and then suddenly maybe in a year or two time we find money again, we don't get those people back.
No, we don't.
That's lost. And suddenly we're having to build these teams back up again. And when we talk about wastes of money, I mean, you could have kept that team on and had consistency for children. You could have had careers for people that are being built, and we as Northern Ireland benefit from that. So not only are we decimating what's happening now, but that is going to have longer term impacts. So we really need to make sure that the community voluntary sector is valued, is funded sustainably and in a long term way, so that they can actually plan for the future. And these 1 year budgets will absolutely not help, and if anything they're really creating serious issues. I mean, every single year this comes around. But
yeah, and again, another theme that we're continuing to hear about is the importance of the community and voluntary sector in Northern Ireland, and we should be shouting from the rooftops our appreciation for what they do on a daily basis and holding up our entire society. But I do know that the lack of multi-year budgets having a very serious strain on those organisations has destroyed a number of them, and that they no longer exist, and has absolutely it caused huge issues with morale. So we're very well aware, and I put firmly on record today our deep appreciation to all the community and voluntary sectors, because our society would be much worse off without their incredible contribution and selflessness as well. David Honeyford.
Just absolutely agree with that. In my own area, dealing with Home Start and people like that, and trying to get funding from other sources to secure them, and the work that is phenomenal. One of the things that struck me, I said just before you came in, one of the things that struck me when I was reading the report was that gap of a year before you even get to school.
Yeah.
So we are, when you said we're paying for it, but just not at the cost of the budget, but not in the right point. But just to follow on from that sort of partnership bit between the voluntary and community sector, the report looking at the co-design process made a really damning review on that, and particularly around the group doing the sort of steps of publishing their own report. But in your view, what would the key issues in the co-design process, or what is the key issues in the co-design process, and what could have been avoided there?
We have enough time. I mean, I think that probably the fundamental problem, and this has been laid out by the group, was really talking about it as a co-design process, because ultimately that isn't what it was. And co-design isn't just a kind of term that we can chuck about. It actually is something that is very meaningful, and the sector has done a lot of work in terms of looking at what does meaningful co-design look like. Before I even get into that, I do want to also say up front, and Chris mentioned it in his comments at the start, is that there was no incorporation in a meaningful way of people with lived experience, and that was entirely put on the groups that participated in this process to somehow be the link. And I, as someone from Bernardo's, was expected to speak on behalf of children living in poverty. I am not a child. I can't speak. I can absolutely talk about our services, and I can talk to our children and feed that back, but that will never ever replace talking to children directly and giving them that forum to speak on their own behalf, because they are so eloquent, and they will absolutely, the things that they will say to you will stay with you, and our officials need to hear that directly, because they're the ones that are drafting this piece of work. So while what happened in the end was that we as organisations all went out and did what we could in terms of focus groups and getting that input in that way, it's not a replacement, and it is absolutely not a good substitute. But the co-design process, I mean, again, I wouldn't take up all the time talking about it, but I think that fundamentally calling it co-design was wrong. And then the process itself did not lend itself to that truly collaborative approach. I think one of the key pieces that was missing was engagement with wider departments. So the only officials that the co-design group really had contact with in a meaningful way was from the Department for Communities, which then meant that we didn't really know what was happening in other departments. Now we understood, and as the paper sets out, there is a cross-departmental group that meets, but our engagement with them was extremely limited. And so how are we supposed to meaningfully co-design a piece of work if we aren't talking to the people who are supposed to be putting into it? And then I suppose jump into the other end of it is this strategy. My understanding is there is something that has been drafted, and it is somewhere within the Department for Communities. As someone who has participated in the co-design process, I couldn't tell you a single word that's on that page. So how can I have said to co-designed it when I presume that there were poverties in there? That's probably what I can tell you about it. Now, I've been told that it does take account of everything that we had, takes account of the expert panel, takes account of what the co-design group did, but I haven't seen it, so I can't tell you that. And my fear is that whatever is produced, I could have serious concerns with, because I haven't been able to speak to it at all. So, I mean, I'm more than happy to go into more detail, but I don't think that the committee necessarily has the time for it. But there were serious challenges, and I hope the lessons can be learned. And there have been other co-design processes that have been better and that we can learn from. And I hope that we can learn from this one too, in a bit of what not to do.
Okay.
Yeah, I wasn't on the co-design group, but I just want to make one point very quickly, and it's about that delay, right? So from what I understand, there's been a heck of a lot of work put into this. It was reported on the 29th of February that the Minister was prioritising. The Minister was working he was trying to prioritise, and then it was also mentioned that we were months away before an anti-poverty strategy could come in front of the executive. It's now, that was 4 months ago, would that be correct?
Mm-hmm.
It's, so back to my original question, why? Mm-hmm. Why is this still being delayed? There's a huge amount of work has went into it. There has to be a draft somewhere. And our question, my question is, what is the delay here? Why is it being held up, and by whom?
You get the sense that there's a great amount of discomfort with publishing the strategy, because maybe some of the things that will arise will not be comfortable for the department.
I couldn't comment on that. I don't know if either of you.
I don't think any of us could really comment on it, but I suppose there may be a concern that it won't meet the standards set for it by the High Court, which says that it has to have smart, targets and timetables and all that. So it's not just, it's not just you folk, it's not just the Department for Communities Committee, it's not just the Audit Office, but there's actually also this High Court judgment that it will have to be weighed against. Yeah, so
I think there's also another element of this, which is the money. And I mean, that's always the issue, but it has to be resourced. There's no point in bringing a strategy forward that's not going to be resourced, and I understand that we are in a challenging budgetary environment. We can't let that stop us from moving forward with the strategy. We need to be able to take action on poverty. We've talked at length in this committee about how we're paying for it on the other side, so let's start somewhere, let's get ahead of it. But I think there's so much willingness, the work has been done, we just need to get moving on this now.
There just seems to be a continuous theme here of forgiveness is easier than the cure, and it is sickening completely. It's entirely reactionary
for our children and families.
Yeah.
I don't think that it's easy to say to them, I'm really sorry that you're in poverty. That's not fair. And again, whenever we're saying we're dealing with the other side of poverty, that's because people's lives have been ruined. Whenever we're talking about children who end up in the justice system, children who end up in our care system, all avoidable if we had just got in early and supported families from the very beginning. Not just are we saving money, but we're saving heartache. We're actually giving people rich, healthy, happy lives. Let's invest our money that way than dealing with the problems on the other end of the spectrum.
Would you agree that it's the case here that departments are just too reactionary and not proactive or solution focused when it comes to problems such as child poverty and mental health, those sorts of things?
yeah, yes, but I do also think that there's a dreadful kind of stigma, or not just stigma, worse than that, an idea that somehow poverty is people's own fault. And when you take into account the fact that about 2/3 of the children who are living in poverty are in families that are actually in employment.
Exactly.
So their parents are working, their parents are doing what they can, but because of low wages, the high costs of childcare, the high costs of working, because the costs of travel to work are really high here in Northern Ireland compared to other parts of these islands. When you put all of those things together, it's really obvious that it's not people's own fault that they're in poverty. But I do think that there is a view among a whole lot of people, including a lot of policymakers, and I'm not just saying politicians, but policymakers generally, that to some extent is people's own fault, and that therefore it's not really as much of an issue. I mean, I'm saying that because we can see that from social attitude surveys and things, and why would policymakers be any different to the general public?
Yeah, and just again very briefly, children cannot afford to wait any longer. We can't wait, and there are some very clear proposals that have been made, including a £20 payment per child, which yes would cost the public purse, but it would save a lot of money in the long run. And it would lift a lot of children out of poverty, and it is not, as has been described by some, an artificial prop. That £20 payment makes a big impact, and we've seen it in other jurisdictions.
Absolutely. I think it's really important that, I think some people hear £20 per week and think, what would I do with £20 a week? I might get myself a takeaway. Well, actually, you're very lucky if that's what you're thinking that £20 a week would do for you, because the families that we're talking about that would get £20 a week can tell you absolutely every single penny that they would spend, and they can tell you that they'll now be able to turn on their heating whenever it gets cold again. They'll be able to tell you that'll mean that they can get that dinner that actually is a bit healthier for their kids that they really wanted to get. It might mean that maybe they can afford to get that book that their kid really wanted, that they said there's no chance that we can afford that, maybe that dad can take his kids to swimming lessons. This is the tangible difference that £20 a week makes. And I really do think that if you're so privileged that you can think of the difference that £20 a week would make to you, then count yourself lucky. And remember those families that will account for every single penny of it.
And we know that, I mean, this £20 isn't just like a mythical thing, because remember, universal credit was uplifted
Yes,
by
that's
£20
right,
a week during COVID, and families tell us the difference that it
Yeah.
made to them then, and we saw for a while the difference that it made, you know, in terms of food bank use and stuff like that going down. So we know that something as little as that can make a big difference to families and to the outcomes for children, to children's mental health, to children's educational outcomes, and to their health outcomes. If mainly because their mothers are less stressed, actually, but other parents are less stressed. But that £20 isn't just something that, you know, people grabbed out of the air. We know we
Yeah.
have the real life impact of it.
Thank you. Good.
Can I just go back? I agree with everything you're saying. It's such a important conversation as well that we're doing. But just something you said, you don't know what's going to be on this report. If it was reported, I find that absolutely unbelievable. But since you've put those reports or findings in, what contact have you had then with the department?
I mean, we have reached out. So the group wrote to the minister a few months back, and very, 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 very recently I received a response which did not accept our request for a meeting. And I think the group is concerned that our involvement in this process is now at an end. Obviously, we aren't anticipating that this is something that's going to be written, and the terms of reference really clearly set out that this is something that's owned by the executive and the officials are drafting it. But to ask for the contribution, the time, the expertise of the sector in a very intensive way. I mean, whenever we started this process, dates were put in our diary for a full year, and we were expected to be at every meeting. And then whenever we turned around our report, we turned it around very quickly in a short period of time. The amount of work that went into this right across the piece was huge. And then to have a situation where I couldn't tell you what's in it. I hope that a lot of what we've said will be in there, but that's acting in a bit of good faith, because I don't know meaningfully, and there's been no kind of plan laid out as to how this group would be brought back into the process. And I know there is a willingness from the group to be involved and to present to the minister, to present to the ministerial steering group as well.
Just to clarify that, you haven't had any contact?
I've had a response to,
Yeah. Okay. No.
Well, your evidence session today, and we're almost at its end, has been a real eye-opener for this committee, and we appreciate the honesty in which you've presented it. And we'll certainly be asking questions of the department as to why they are not meeting with you, so we can give you that assurance following today. Padraig Delargy.
Hey Chair, just checking you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. We can't see you, Padraig.
Yeah, sorry, I'm having a couple of technical difficulties. It's been cut in and out, so I was just checking you could hear me.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Listen, thanks very much for your answer so far. There were a couple of kind of supplementary questions I'd hoped to ask there, but I think you've answered most of them. I suppose for me, really, it's what would make the biggest difference in tackling child poverty.
I think what we've just already said, Padraig, that extra child payment would make a huge difference, and we know that from Scotland. We didn't just pull these things out of the air, as I said. We know it from both universal credit, the universal credit £20 uplift, and from what's happening in Scotland.
And to add to that as well, I think it's really important to recognise the environment that we're now living in. So £20 a week was a recommendation that the co-design group made in 2022, I think, when we released our paper. We're now in 2024, and how much has changed since then. So I think we're talking a minimum of £20 per week per child. But we know, as Greta said, that again, this is evidence-based. It's based on evidence from what's happened here during COVID, but also what's happening in Scotland, that it will absolutely lift children out of poverty.
Yeah,
Thank you. I appreciate that. I suppose the only other just two short points that I had were just from the report. I mean, on page 42 there, I'm looking at it's a phrase that I see in all the reports, and it's stakeholders. And it's a phrase that, to be honest, kind of frustrates me because it doesn't actually say who we're talking about here. So I suppose really it's how much evidence we're getting. I know, Greta, and I think you touched on a really important point earlier, that it is very difficult to to get specific families, to get specific people to talk about this because of the nature of it. But I think that phrase stakeholders would just like a wee bit more clarification on exactly who those stakeholders exactly are, and ensure that we're speaking to people. The other thing then, just on page 60, was the 24% gap in GCSE attainment as well. Something I suppose as a former teacher that stood out to me in particular. I just think it's a really stark figure. I suppose I'm making those more just for comment than anything else, but they were two things that struck me in particular. Were the stakeholder piece in terms of who's actually involved specifically in that, and to what extent, and then in terms of the GCSE attainment as well, I think just really stood out. But I know, look, in terms, even of your answer to my previous question as well, I think by this stage you've answered all the questions. It was just to provide clarity on that, singular point. If there was a specific key action, I know all the actions are key, but if there was a specific one coming out of this. So thanks very much for your presentation.
I just respond very briefly. Padraig, I would argue from my perspective, key stakeholders are the children. So you and I were in the Craigan last week or the week before, talking with children and their parents, and I think that's the starting point. They're key to all of this. In terms of educational attainment, the DE Perm Sec was in front of committee recently, and he spoke very eloquently about the link between poverty and educational underachievement.
Yeah.
So it's stark. The figures are there. We know all of this. I would just make one passing comment on how we measure children, though, and it's not a criticism of your question, Padraig, by any stretch, but we're hung up on measuring children's success by 5 GCSEs. We need to measure children's success on their well-being. We need to measure success by a child that goes to school who is not hungry, who has had sleep, who has come from a loving environment, and those children deserve to live in their utopia. They should not have to worry about the food or the clothes that they wear or the heating. So just, I know I went off on a wee bit of a tangent there, but
no, I totally agree with you, Chris, and I suppose that specifically is my point as well around stakeholders, because I think it's a term that suggests that it's very much I suppose a policy document only, and to me that's a vital part of it. But the key part of this is actually hearing from young people who are impacted by this, hearing from families, hearing actual lived experiences, and I'm totally in agreement with you there. Because to me that is critical, and it's just that phrase stakeholder sometimes jumps out at me because I think that it suggests that that's not as key a part, but I'm totally in agreement with you on that. And I know we had these discussions, as you said, last week or the week before there, really stark, particularly in my own constituency in Derry, and looking forward to working with all of you to actually ensure that we can reduce and we can actually end child poverty.
Thank you. And I was just thinking there, as the questions were evolving, just in relation to children in residential care and the significant cost associated with that, and the key contributor to children ended up in residential care is poverty, and £260,000 a year per child is the cost. Is correct? Is it? It's significant.
Yeah, children's support needs are simply not being met. And it goes back to the early intervention piece and the housing and homelessness piece that Greta referred to earlier.
When you put it into context, Greta, the three of you have put a heavy weight on the importance of that £20. And some could easily just throw that away as, it's just £20, and you've rightly articulated how important that is for people in that very difficult situation. But when you look at the cost of children ended up in care, £260,000, how many the whole system is just completely upside down.
And it's even worse. I mean, we when we look at children with complex needs, disabled children with complex needs, some of them, because they're let down so badly by not having early intervention, that they end up in these specialist units for the rest of their lives, costing the Health and Social Care Trust, you know, an individual one, maybe £500,000 a year. And that's for the rest of their lives. And can you imagine also what that does to their families? You know, the way the family is going to feel like they've really let the child down, that they're essentially institutionalised for all of their life. Instead of if they had the early intervention, being able to have a decent life and one where they were able to actually, you know, contribute to society rather than being locked away, which is how some end up.
And we had our review recently of the Independent Review of Children's Social Care Services by Ray Jones, and he very clearly talked about poverty, and that was something that he saw as a key factor in driving the issues that we're seeing in social care at the moment. And I mean, a lot of the issues that we're talking about here in terms of the role of the community voluntary sector, but also the funding, the way that we're approaching in silo working is absolutely replicated there. So these are problems that again dovetail into each other, unfortunately. Where you have poverty, you're often having those same challenges, and families just aren't having their needs met at all.
And therein lies the story in terms of ensuring that departments work together, because a lack of early intervention is leading to poorer health outcomes, which is impacting the Department of Health. In terms of education, whether it be special educational needs or other complex needs, the justice system, it's all inextricably linked, which it's the whole thing's a real mess, to be honest. Colin?
Small point, just on the graph again, because it is striking, and I fully agree with you, Chris, that this should not be, nor is it, any measure of the value or the worth of children. But what it does provide, in the striking similarities between the two lines, is a longitudinal evidence of the impact of poverty. And if that is not a call to action, then what would be?
Thank you. Thank you, members. Dorina, have you any comments?
No, just to I suppose say to the committee, you know, your witnesses have brought a richness and a strength to that evidence that our report couldn't bring to you, being much closer to children than we are in the audit office. So I think you've had a really useful evidence session today, so thank you.
Thank you, Dorina. Stuart, have you any?
Chair, just to echo the support, I think really from the Department of Finance in terms of the issues raised. You know, we take it very seriously about reducing bureaucracy. For example, it's something I worked on at DAO back in 2015 around reducing bureaucracy for the community and voluntary sector. You know, and it's disappointing that we're 9 years later down the line and that issue remains the case, especially in terms of collaboration. So I think it highlights how important this inquiry is, Chair.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Stuart. Chris, thank you. Thank you, Tressa, and thank you, Reddy, for being with us. Your evidence session was invaluable. It was exceptional, actually, and really did provide a very, very difficult insight, actually, into some of the very serious challenges that exist for the most vulnerable in our society, being our children, the people that we should all be working collectively for to ensure that they've a good quality of life with opportunities and that their well-being is a priority for this House. So I do appreciate that very much, and thank you for being with us and for your time and taking our questions.
Welcome. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having us.
Chris, we had said earlier, and it's been a key thing of how we've conducted the inquiry as well, we want the work of this committee to be as front-facing as possible, and I think given the evidence session today, if you would be so kind that we could have a photograph with the three of you as well, because we're going to be continually putting out the evidence that we're receiving. So.
Yeah, that would be a pleasure. Yeah, do you want us to sit or stand or?
Yeah. So we'll adjourn briefly, we'll do it, and then we'll complete the business. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's very warm here, isn't it?
We're nearly
It's
done.
really warm, yeah.
We do it the last time with the mental health shop. Oh, bottom of the stairs.
We could do it there today.
Yeah, whatever.
Committee Room 30. Sound. 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 Committee Room 30. Sound.